In my last video about the fall of Austria-Hungary, one of the most frequent comments about the collapse of the empire that I received was simple: just don't declare war on Serbia. And this sentence, it kind of haunted me. It seems obvious. Austria-Hungary was the aggressor. They overreacted to an assassination and plunged Europe into catastrophe. Honestly, it's a simplistic narrative that I myself have been taught by my teachers. But then I put my tick history hat on and asked, but is that really the case? Because when you dig into the private correspondence, intelligence reports, and behind closed doors discussions of Austria-Hungary's leadership in 1914, a very different story starts to unfold. Not the public posturing or the declarations of war, but the private fears and perceptions of an empire in crisis. An empire that believed it was being strangled by threats from both the inside and outside, regardless of whether those perceptions matched reality. This was a nation teetering on the edge, where even the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, a man who had personally blocked military action for years, became the very spark that unleashed forces long held in check. Recent scholarship has challenged the old story of reckless Austrian aggression and asks us to consider something more unsettling. What if Austria-Hungary wasn't choosing war, but saw itself with no other choice? What if this was the desperate move of a declining power, encircled by enemies and running out of time? Today, we're not here to excuse Austria-Hungary's decisions, but we are here to objectively understand them, because history is rarely as simple as we're taught in school. By 1914, Austria-Hungary's leadership perceived itself as trapped in an impossible strategic position, a perception shaped both by genuine strategic challenges and by policies the Habsburg Empire had itself pursued. The assassination in Sarajevo may have been the immediate trigger, but it wasn't the cause. The real story lies in how a great power came to see itself as systematically encircled by hostile forces, facing what they believed was the grim reality that every passing year only made their position more precarious. Let's begin with the numbers that haunted Austrian strategists. Austria-Hungary's peacetime army was half the size of France's or Germany's forces relative to population. In wartime, they faced the monumental challenge of expanding from 415,000 soldiers to over 2 million, a nearly five-fold increase. Yet the majority of these troops, 3 out of every 4, would be minimally trained draftees with little to no military experience. Meanwhile, Russia loomed as a formidable adversary, capable of mobilizing far greater numbers and deploying them faster thanks to its expanding rail network. Each year, this disparity grew worse, further eroding Austria-Hungary's already fragile position. But demographics were only a part of the crisis. Austria-Hungary's alliances were crumbling from within, leaving it increasingly isolated. Italy, which was ostensibly an ally since 1882, had been covertly undermining the Habsburgs for over a decade. By 1902, Italian intelligence had ceased operations against France and shifted its focus entirely to Austria-Hungary. Italian spies mapped Austrian defenses and gathered military secrets, while their government remained publicly pledged to defend those same territories. Romania's betrayal was even more alarming. Despite a secret defensive alliance, Romanian intelligence actively collaborated with Russia against Austria-Hungary. Romanian authorities arrested Austrian agents while turning a blind eye to Russian espionage networks expanding throughout Habsburg territories. This left Austria-Hungary embroiled in what analysts described as a Cold War with Russia, Romania, and even Italy, official allies conducting coordinated intelligence operations in anticipation of a future conflict. The strategic mathematics were devastating. Chief of Staff Konrad von Hötzendorf understood that the empire's greatest vulnerability was a two-front war. His worst fear was a Russian assault while Habsburg forces were tied up in the Balkans, a scenario that was increasingly likely as the alliances faltered. By 1914, the empire was staring down the barrel of a closing strategic window. What may look like aggressive action, in hindsight, was, from Austria-Hungary's perspective, a desperate final attempt to stave off inevitable decline. While Austria-Hungary's leaders worried about external encirclement, they also perceived an internal danger that they considered even more threatening. Since 1903, Serbia had been pursuing the vision of Greater Serbia, the unification of all South Slavs under Serbian leadership. From Vienna's perspective, this ambition directly targeted Austria-Hungary's most fragile territories and posed what they saw as a clear existential threat. Those Serbian leaders argued they were simply responding to the national aspirations of oppressed Slavic populations within the Habsburg Empire. Austrian leaders considered this danger far from hypothetical. By 1914, Austrian military commanders believed they were grappling with systematic Serbian subversion within their own borders, though the extent and coordination of such activities remains today debated by historians. General Oskar Potiorek, the military governor of Bosnia-Herzegovina, reported that Serbian agents were infiltrating political parties and cultural associations to spread what he described as the poison of high treason systematically and drop by drop into the population. These weren't isolated acts of dissent, but part of a more calculated strategy. Potiorek suspected that these activities were masking a clandestine Serbian military shadow government, orchestrating acts of sedition throughout Bosnia-Herzegovina. Austrian Chief of Staff Konrad von Hötzendorf was equally convinced. As he asserted, "For me, there never existed a doubt that revolutionary actions directed against the monarchy took place with the knowledge and patronage of the Serbian government." Military intelligence also painted a grim picture. In the event of conflict, Serbian guerrilla fighters known as komendadžije were expected to infiltrate Austria-Hungary to incite widespread rebellion. Colonel Oskar Hranjilović, head of the Austrian Army Intelligence, warned that their goal was to transform the population of Bosnia and Herzegovina into insurgents. This meant that Austria-Hungary anticipated internal revolt even before setting foot on Serbian soil. The timing only magnified the threat. In the wake of the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, Serbia had doubled in size, emboldened by military victories and Russian backing. Serbian nationalism surged, and their territorial ambitions grew even more audacious. For Austria-Hungary's leadership, this internal menace, combined with the growing external encirclement and diplomatic isolation, created a nightmare scenario, a multi-front war coupled with rebellion on their own territory. Every year of inaction thus allowed Serbian networks to expand, becoming more deeply entrenched within the empire's borders. And to Vienna's strategists, the strategic logic was stark: act decisively while they still had some control, or risk watching their empire unravel as internal subversion merged with external pressure. Finally, Austria-Hungary's most desperate vulnerability wasn't just external threats or internal subversion, it was their own political system. Far from being an outdated autocracy, Austria-Hungary was a constitutional monarchy with a democratically elected parliament operating under universal male suffrage. The empire had been divided by the Great Compromise of 1867 into two separate kingdoms, Austria and Hungary, each with its own parliament and government. While foreign policy remained under the control of Emperor Franz Joseph through a joint cabinet, domestic governance was split between the two halves. Crucially, the Great Compromise included a clause that prevented the joint army from being deployed in Hungary without explicit approval from the Hungarian government. So that is just a complicated way of saying that for military leaders tasked with defending the empire, it was a constitutional framework that was just a pure nightmare. It obstructed effective governance, hindered resource allocation for military spending, and exacerbated the national tensions threatening the very monarchy's survival. While Austria-Hungary's adversaries could act swiftly and decisively, the Habsburg Empire was paralyzed by the need to navigate a labyrinth of constitutional procedures, even in moments of crisis. This paralysis left the empire vulnerable precisely when decisiveness was most critical. Serbia's subversion and Russia's encirclement couldn't be ignored, yet Austria-Hungary's system of governance rendered it impossible to respond effectively. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in June of 1914, the empire faced an existential dilemma. On July 25th, a state of emergency was declared across Austria-Hungary. Initially, these measures aimed to ensure smooth mobilization, but emergency rule quickly became permanent. Plans to restore constitutional governance were abandoned as the empire scrambled to confront escalating threats from both the inside and the outside. And this marked a turning point. Austria-Hungary's leaders found themselves forced to choose between upholding democratic governance or preserving the state itself. The political system that had been carefully designed for peacetime administration now proved ill-suited for the existential crisis that it faced. In many ways, this wasn't a flaw in Austria-Hungary's system. It was a feature, but it was a feature that left them increasingly unable to adapt to the strategic threats closing in around them. By 1914, there was one final obstacle preventing military intervention, and on June 28th, that obstacle was removed. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne, was Austria-Hungary's staunchest advocate for peace. For years, he had blocked his own military leaders from pursuing war. Each time Chief of Staff Konrad von Hötzendorf proposed preventative military action against Serbia in 1909, Italy in 1911, and Serbia again in 1913, Franz Ferdinand firmly opposed him. Their disagreements ran deeper than just tactical decisions. They were battles over Austria-Hungary's entire strategy. Franz Ferdinand believed in diplomacy over war. He sought improved relations with Romania and a rapprochement with Russia, aiming to revive the Three Emperors League. While Conrad saw Serbia as the central threat, the Archduke remained focused on maintaining peace, even at significant cost to the empire. This difference in vision created a profound rift. Franz Ferdinand repeatedly thwarted Conrad's ambitions, insisting on diplomatic solutions even as Austria-Hungary's strategic position eroded. By 1914, many military leaders viewed the Archduke not as a stabilizing force, but as a roadblock preventing action while the empire's vulnerabilities deepened. And so it was that when Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, Austria-Hungary didn't just lose its heir apparent, it lost the most powerful voice for peace within its leadership. The murder of the Archduke by conspirators with links to the Serbian nationalist networks removed the primary obstacle to military intervention just as the empire's leaders believed their position was approaching a real breaking point. The tragic irony is that Franz Ferdinand's death, caused by a Serbian conspiracy, eliminated the one figure who might have actually prevented Austria-Hungary from going to war. For those who remained in power, however, his assassination marked an opportunity. It erased the barrier to action at the very moment when leaders believed their window to act was closing. The Habsburg leadership ultimately concluded, as noted in their official publication, that military action against Serbia was both a response to the Sarajevo murder and a recognition of their declining strategic position. It wasn't just about revenge, but it was about seizing what they saw as their last chance to strike before the empire was strangled by its enemies. By July of 1914, Austria-Hungary faced a perfect storm. Recent scholarship has moved beyond simplistic blame narratives to examine the more complex interplay of actions by all the great and smaller powers involved in the July crisis. When viewed in context, Austria-Hungary's decision to go to war appears less as a reckless aggression and more as a desperate attempt to address an untenable strategic situation. Surrounded by hostile or unreliable allies conducting intelligence operations against them, the Habsburg Empire also faced coordinated internal subversion that threatened its own cohesion. Their constitutional system, designed for peacetime governance, crippled their ability to act decisively in a crisis. And the one man who had consistently blocked military solutions, Franz Ferdinand, was eliminated by the very networks the empire sought to combat. To Austria-Hungary's leadership, 1914 felt like a use-it-or-lose-it moment. They believed they could act while they still retained some military and political leverage, or delay and risk total collapse. From their perspective, waiting meant a stronger Russia, an emboldened Italy, a fully aligned Romania, and a deeper internal crisis. Their strategic calculus, whether accurate or not, left them convinced that they had few viable options other than to strike while they still had a chance. Yet the enduring narrative of Austrian aggression isn't rooted in 1914, but in the politics of the post-war world. The Treaty of Versailles assigned war guilt to Germany, while the separate Treaty of Saint-Germain forced the new Austrian Republic to accept responsibility for the war's destruction. These assignments were not purely historical judgments, but political tools, crafted to justify reparations and reframe the war's legacy. The successor states of Austria-Hungary, like Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and others, also had both political incentives and genuine historical grievances that shaped their narratives about Habsburg rule. Emphasizing the empire's responsibility for the war helped legitimize their independence claims. But these narratives also did reflect real experiences of political marginalization and cultural suppression. The complex reality is that these new states emerged both from genuine liberation movements and also the violent collapse of an empire that had struggled to balance competing national aspirations. Austria-Hungary's tragedy lay in the impossibility of their situation. By the time they felt compelled to act, any decision risked igniting the continental war they sought to avoid. Declining powers often faced such grim choices: endure a slow strangulation or gamble everything on a decisive act. Austria-Hungary chose the latter, and in doing so, they not only sealed their own fate, but also unleashed unprecedented devastation across all of Europe. So, to those who argue that Austria-Hungary should have just not declared war on Serbia, this perspective overlooks the profound constraints and pressures that the empire faced. From Vienna's vantage point, choosing inaction meant accepting continued internal subversion, the erosion of alliances, and the tightening encirclement by hostile powers. In their eyes, the declaration of war was not an aggressive choice, but an act of desperation, a last fragile attempt to secure their survival in an increasingly hostile world. The question then, from the Austro-Hungarian point of view, is not whether Austria-Hungary was justified in going to war, but whether, given their strategic position in 1914, they perceived any viable alternative. Hi everyone, thank you so much for watching. I wanted to take a moment just to say how incredibly grateful I am for the amazing support on my last video. It truly blew me away. I also want to thank each and every one of you who has joined the Discord community. For those who don't know, in my spare time, I'm developing The Infiltrated. It's a free-to-play, browser-based strategy game. If you're curious about the game or just want to stay updated and connect with our growing community of history and philosophy nerds, feel free to join us on the Discord using the link below. So thanks again for watching, and as always, stay curious about history.